So Jaynee is a strong Indigenous woman from the Wasauga-Sing First Nation Reservation. She is married and an amazing mother of two. Jaynee has devoted her life to serving others. She is currently studying to be an addiction and mental health counselor with the goal of opening a wellness center to serve the needs of Indigenous people on her reservation. She has an immense amount of life experience, which allows her to connect with individuals on a deeper understanding, and we're so fortunate to have her with us tonight. Without further ado, here's Jaynee. Thank you, Jaynee. Here's Jaynee, everyone.
Thank you. Ani Bojo, hello and welcome. Sangay Makwa Tagosi. My Indigenous name is Strong Voice Bear, but you can call me Jaynee because I can see how that might be a little bit difficult to remember. Thank you kindly for the introduction, and thank you everyone who has joined us tonight. As Angela mentioned, feel free to comment, ask questions throughout the workshop, and if you're not comfortable with speaking, you can comment in the chat. Crystal is our moderator for the night, and she will be watching for comments. So let's get started. So on tonight's agenda, we're going to do an introduction, who is affected, the causes, historical intergenerational trauma, the effects, why it affects further generations, and how to break the cycle and heal. And then we will have our closing. So this is the introduction to intergenerational trauma, part 1. Next Tuesday, I will be facilitating intergenerational trauma, part 2, focusing on the Indigenous population. So I look forward to you guys joining that session as well. Okay, so what is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma, sometimes also known as transgenerational trauma, is a term that is used to describe the impact of a traumatic experience, not only one generation, but on subsequent generations after an event. Who is affected by intergenerational trauma? Everyone. Can you guys give me any examples of who could be affected? And this is just a generalization. When you see everyone, how can everyone be affected by intergenerational trauma? Do you have any ideas?
Well, Jaynee, I think I feel like intergenerational trauma can affect everyone, like you said, because intergenerational trauma is something that is, learned behaviors or learned affects throughout your generation. So things that your great-great-great-grandmother did with her children is then passed down through each generation as they go when they come to you. And then you in turn also pass some of that intergenerational trauma onto your children as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Crystal. That was a really good explanation. I do believe there's some hands up. Moderator, if
yeah, I have.
Has her hands
yeah,
up.
I have one person in the chat as well. Danielle says survivors of combat trauma and war-related trauma.
Most definitely, yes. That is definitely an impact on generations to come, especially if there are issues that have never been dealt with or healed. So thank you for that, Danielle. I believe, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think Jess has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. So I think children or descendants of individuals who have suffered from addiction or abuse.
Very good. Thank you, Jess. That's spot on. So you guys answered some of my questions. So what are some of the examples that could lead to intergenerational trauma? So we talked about abuse, we talked about the war, we talked about situations that can be transferred from grandparents down to children. Do you have any more specific examples that could lead to intergenerational trauma? And it doesn't have to be on like a huge spectrum in terms of population, but it could be something as simple as, like, for me, for instance, when I grew up, my mother wasn't very affectionate. She didn't hug, she didn't say I loved you. And for that reason, I thought that she didn't love me. I thought she didn't like me, or she didn't care about me. But as I got older and I got to understand her intergenerational trauma, her father was a survivor of World War II. Her mother also was a part of this era, and they lived through the Depression, suffered many hard things throughout their life, and she was never maybe shown how to give affection. So she then carried her weight. It was very army like orientated at home as well. Everything was scheduled, time, like boom, boom, boom. So she had that army like sort of mentality with raising us. And so, yeah, so that's how something simple can pass down through intergenerational trauma. Does anybody have something they would like to share with how maybe they see intergenerational trauma or experienced it?
Hey, Jaynee, I got some great feedback from the chat.
Okay.
We have examples like domestic violence, child abuse, neglect, and slavery as some examples.
It's amazing. Yes. Those are all great examples. Thank you guys for all of that. And if anybody else wants to share an experience or anything, feel free. Jess, you have your hand up. You're more than welcome to share.
Thank you. So my family and I are, as in like my husband and my child, and I are part of a minority group, a minority religious group, not just being Muslim in a non-Muslim country, but also being a minority within the Islamic religion called Shia. And in many places in the world, in many countries in the world, Shia are minorities, even in Muslim countries. And in some of these countries where Shia are minorities, they've been for years, generations, they've been persecuted, oppressed. So my husband, actually, he comes from a country in the Middle East, and he suffers from intergenerational trauma because of this. His family have for generations been oppressed by the government and the majority population. His father, back in when was it, maybe the 70s, had to flee from the country, and he lived in the United States for a while. He eventually went back, but now my husband is experiencing the same thing. He had to flee, and that's why he's in Canada right now.
Wow, Jess, that's quite a story, and thank you so much for opening up and sharing that with us. It is so unfortunate that oppression happens for just based off of, an ethnic background, a religious, just for being who you are. And I hope that your husband, gets through everything and comes out stronger and more resilient. Thank you very much for sharing that.
And I have one person that shared their story in the chat as well. It says, unfortunately, I dealt with the similar issues in my culture, meaning similar to Angela as well. She's Macedonian, and basically it's the same. Women are treated much differently than men, and she always had to overdo things to be acknowledged. And someone asked, can loss be considered in this category? I know that loss can be very traumatic, which is a really good question, Jaynee. I'm not sure how to answer.
It's so, there's a process when you go through loss, and it's okay to grieve and go through those processes. But there are situations and times when it can become unhealthy, and maybe you're unable to cope with a loss. And if your children see this and see the impact, because unfortunately some people can end up going into deep depression, can end up becoming suicidal. There's so many different things that can happen because of a loss of somebody who's super close to you. So depending on how your reaction is, teaches another generation how to react as well. So in turn, it can develop into something that turns into intergenerational trauma, that your child may not know how to grieve in a healthy way. And yeah, so I could see how that could be considered intergenerational trauma, if that makes sense. Okay, so moving on. Some of the reasons I've listed were parental incarceration, divorce, alcohol and drug use, domestic violence, child abuse, whether it be sexual, physical, and emotional, and natural disasters. These are all things that can impact intergenerational trauma in our future generations. So, we must also consider historical events that may have a lasting impact on generations to come. What is historical generational trauma? Does anybody have an idea of what type of trauma this would be considered?
Possibly survivors of the Holocaust.
Yes, most definitely.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Amina.
Slavery.
Yes, definitely slavery. Jess?
The indigenous peoples of the world, basically all over the world, all those who have been colonized.
Yes, thank you. James?
I was gonna say people from Vietnam War, like even before it, like anyone that, like war related, that could be brought on as historical generational trauma.
Definitely. I got a very smart audience tonight. Yes, you guys are spot on. So
I have another, I don't know if this would be considered historical generational trauma as it's still going on, but would the situation in Palestine be I mean, it has been going on for about 73 years, but it's still going. Would that be considered historical?
most definite. It's relevant and prevalent to today as well as in our history, just like the indigenous population, and so many other populations, unfortunately, have the history, but also the present generational trauma, because right now the survivors, are only going to pass on their traumas to their kids, and they've already had that trauma installed in them from their history and before generations.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah. So like in most cases, it is still going on anyway.
Yes. So it's definitely going to impact the future generations to come, as it's affected those individuals that are currently living it. So the actual textbook definition is historical generational trauma is a trauma experienced by a group with a history of suffering from systematic oppression, more specifically known as genocide. Can you think of examples? So we just discussed many great examples of histories that are suffering intergenerational trauma. And listed, I have a few more to add, like the refugee camp survivors, the slavery survivors, war-stricken countries, genocide of a certain group of people. And just in case you're unaware of what genocide is, it's the systematic annihilation of a group of people for simply being who they are, whether in ethnic, religious, or social terms. Yes, Amina?
Sorry. Thank you. What was I gonna, so I was gonna ask if like systemic oppression, right? Because well, you kind of answered it in this slide, but like systemic oppression in the sense of like people who are at high risk of poverty, like just society, like the government always like this, they've always been doing that and they're still doing that now, but like taxing people or just no like low income, I don't know. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
No, of course. Like these have like detrimental impacts on these individuals. They go into like a survival mode. And
yeah,
you know, if you don't have much money, like we all know that finances causes a lot of stress if you don't have or don't know where your next meal is coming. And our children see us in those stress modes and in that survival mode. And you can then pass on that way of living to those younger generations, despite change. Like even say you land a great job or something like that, these individuals may still need to feel like they need to be in survival mode.
yeah.
That is definitely a great example. And thanks for bringing that up, Amina. Toyin, I seen you had your hand up. Did you want to comment?
Yes, I just want to make a point concerning when you talk about genocide. We have one that has happened in the Burundi some time ago. That is the Tutsi and I think the Gypsy. That so many people were killed based on their ethnic group. The minority were killed.
Yes. Yes, you know, Toyin, it's a topic that is so near and dear to my heart, and it's just so devastating. As I was doing research for this project, to see the amounts of populations and cultures that have endured genocide and are at risk of genocide currently, it's just very devastating and eye-opening as well. It's horrible. Thank you for that though, Toyin. So moving on. Okay. When historical trauma is left unaddressed, it can have a cumulative impact that reverberates across generations in the form of psychological, emotional, and even physical trauma. So basically, if these issues are never addressed, it can impact you in so many different ways, whether you know it or not. Yeah, Amina? Or is that from before?
I'm sorry, that's from before.
Okay, just checking.
I will lower it now.
Thank you. Okay, so these events and situations have not directly happened to our generation. So why would it be that it would have any effect on us? Does anybody know why?
I think sometimes because, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think because in the past it was never talked about, and the people who experienced these traumas never really healed.
Definitely. So the behaviors are then passed down through generations. And Jess?
I was basically going to say pretty much the same thing as Amina. Yeah. Just they weren't given the opportunity to heal, so they kind of internalized these survival negative coping mechanisms, and then they treated their own children in the same way. So their children learned from them and didn't know any other way. So then they passed it down to their children through behavior, I guess.
Exactly, Jess. Thank you so very much. And Sean?
Yes, sorry if I'm just kind of clarifying. The idea is that it's familial and it's also genetic. So any long-lasting trauma, such as that, is going to have a direct impact on your younger generations, on your children and your family. So again, that'll be a familial and genetic factor. So there's really no denying it. And that is kind of what leads that effect long-term when it comes to intergenerational trauma. Yeah.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Sean. You guys hit the nail on the head. So what kind of ways could intergenerational trauma affect you? How do you think that going through or living through intergenerational trauma can affect you?
in unknown ways.
Yep.
It's really, I would think it would come down to different realizations, whether or not it's a specific culture or it's in a reaction to the fact that, you know, you have your languages that are being lost. If it's the indigenous, for example, some of these things are hard to grasp. They're pieces of yourself and pieces of your culture. And I think it's, forgive me, it's not my place to say, but it's setting a framework for reconciliation, because in certain circumstances, so much has been lost.
Thank you for that acknowledgement. And you're, again, spot on. And I think a lot of times, especially when it comes to intergenerational trauma, we're carrying around a trauma that we don't even know where it stemmed from or where it came from. So that's completely valid and correct that we may not even know. But let's take a look at some.
Before you go on, I have a couple of comments in the chat for you.
Okay.
One individual said relationships with others, attachment issues, lacking coping skills, low self-esteem, and poor communication can all be affects to us. And another individual wrote low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, insomnia, anger, and self-destructive behaviors as examples for you, Jaynee.
Hey, good job, guys. Very impressed. All of those are correct. So the maladaptive behaviors and patterns passed down from parents to child, then passed from child to child. Hold on.
Oh, wow. Jaynee, I just got a really good comment here. Another example that I haven't really heard yet, which I feel is like really, really true, but somebody wrote intolerant of others' beliefs.
That is definitely a good one, because like that's a really difficult, especially like when it comes to different ethnics, different religions, and just beliefs in general. That's a good answer. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's definitely not listed. Thank you for that.
And I have someone that said that as someone who has experienced childhood trauma themselves, they don't even realize that the things that they're doing every day reflect that trauma as well. So thank you for that, Jaynee, for pointing it out.
And it's that's where this comes in. It's like the maladaptive behaviors. We just, they're learned and we just carry them. And sometimes we don't even know why we do the things we do or why we react the way that we do. And that's why, like, taking, some time and reflecting, like, what happened to my past generations? And could they be impacting me in my everyday life today, which I would think they are. So here are some. So we have defensive behaviors around expression or emotions. There's denial, there's mental health problems, suicidal behaviors, eating disorders and obesity, alcohol and substance abuse, aggression, violence, criminal behavior, high-risk sexual behavior, low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, insomnia, anger, self-destructive behaviors, hypervigilance, nightmares, inability to commit with others, and fearfulness. So as we can see, trauma can affect you in so many different ways, and it's unique to each and every one of us on how we process that.
And a couple more to throw into the mix from the chat is risk of continuing on the pattern in that same pattern, and lack of self-awareness.
Most definitely, most definitely. We will get into the lack of self-awareness. So what can we do if you are a survivor of intergenerational trauma? And I just wanted to stress the survivor. We could put, what could you do if you're a victim of intergenerational trauma? But survivor is a more positive way to address it, because if you have lived through intergenerational trauma and you are here today to talk about this, then you are a survivor. But what can we do if you are an individual who has gone through intergenerational trauma?
Learn more about it so you can teach people, like spread awareness about what happened.
Most definitely. Definitely. That is a good one, Jess. Thank you.
A comment from the box. Survivors can educate others. So you can educate others in your family about, the awareness of the intergenerational trauma that their family is going through. Communicating with your family is an important key. And another person said, talk to someone.
Yes, those are all very, very important. And the hard part is when you think of our older generations, they were almost like taught, like with Indigenous people specifically, they were not supposed to talk about these things. It was so traumatic. Like even my grandfather never talked about the war. So you have this emotional detachment, and it is very important to speak about these things as much as they may hurt. Otherwise, my next slide. Break the cycle. The cycle won't break if we don't talk about it, if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't educate ourselves. So the key thing is to break the cycle with intergenerational trauma. And how do you break the cycle? As we discussed, education, awareness. And then there is therapy that is specific to individuals who have and are surviving intergenerational trauma or still suffering and living through the effects. So the first one is narrative exposure therapy. And this focuses on treating clients who experience complex or multiple traumatic experiences, helping individuals reframe their traumatic experience that allows them to contextualize the experience. This modality focuses on clients recounting their life events in a way that also integrates some positive events the client has experienced. So that's one form of therapy. Another one is the intergenerational trauma treatment model. And this is designed to treat the unresolved trauma impact from childhood and parents, caregivers, treats 2 generations at once. And I like that method. We also have the trauma-focused conjugative behavioral therapy. And this is an evidence-based treatment related to trauma, combining psychoeducation and cognitive techniques to teach children and adults how to express themselves, coping skills to deal with stressors, develop relaxation techniques, create and process trauma narratives, and manage behaviors that could be detrimental to their overall mental health. So lastly, in closing, I would like to read a quote that I like. It is, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Sometimes it takes only one act of kindness and caring to change a person's life. Be kind to yourself. You're amazing, you are good enough, and you are worth it." Thank you so much for joining us tonight at Healing Connections. I hope that you join us next Tuesday for Intergenerational Trauma Part 2, focusing on the Indigenous population. And if you ever need someone to talk to, don't hesitate to reach out to Healing Connections. And we thank you very much for your support.
I have a question for you, Jaynee. Somebody asked, would service animals be considered a method of coping?
Definitely. Animals have just, I'm an animal lover, but they carry a different energy that is just, some people, very soothing. They can also detect, like, if you're going to have an anxiety attack or things like that. So they've been trained to help you individually, specifically with whatever it is that you're struggling with. And I think it would be completely beneficial, and maybe even a way of me getting another dog, possibly. So most definitely.
Great answer. Thank you very much for answering that.
You're welcome. I see there's a lot of comments in the chats. I'm assuming you're all caught up with that.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have individuals that are sending their thanks to you.
Lots of thanks from the chat.
Lots of thanks from the chat, and very informative session, and happy to have joined. Thank you, Jaynee. Good job.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you, Jaynee. That was awesome.